Hello, this is Liberty, and today I'm going to discuss Chapter 3 of Long's 2015 book, Second Language Acquisition and Task-Based Language Teaching. And this video is essentially me reacting to the book. And there are three main areas that I want to talk about, roughly following the order of ideas in the chapter. So the first one is the status of second language acquisition, or SLA, as a science. And then the second part, I'll talk about the critical period hypothesis. And then the last part, I will talk about implicit and explicit learning. And this is the chapter where we get Long's theory of SLA. So it's very exciting. Beginning with the first section, Long is reflecting on SLA as a field, and he acknowledges it's not very advanced. It may be pre-scientific. And grouping SLA theories into research traditions helps to some extent to make the field seem less fragmented and more coherent. But even then, there is still disagreement between researchers, about very basic things, such as whether the capacity for language learning is genetic, whether language learning is just an individual phenomenon or a social co-constructed phenomenon, whether there are biologically scheduled constraints on the ability to learn languages. And on the other hand, the field of instructed second language acquisition, or ISLA, has a narrower scope and therefore a bit more unity. I think just because in ISLA, people are all focused on a more narrowly practical question. And I guess the types of data that they get in ISLA will be more uniform because it will mostly be classroom research. And even then, there are still controversies in ISLA. So I'm just going to read from page 33 here. We by no means fully understand how adults learn second languages and dialects with or without the aid of instruction, or why so many fail. Just some of the factors and some parts of the process. As in any scientific field, so in ISLA, absent comprehensive understanding of the variables and mechanisms involved and how they interact, what is required is a theory. So I think he's saying for learning a language, there are many factors involved, and we couldn't possibly hold all of them in mind. And so we need a general theory of language learning which accounts for success or failure just at the level of detail that we need. My comment here is I think that there is a risk of interpreting this as saying that there is a reason or a set of reasons for people learning or failing to learn. So generally the view in the research is that success in acquiring a second language boils down to some combination of age, aptitude, motivation, and attitude or personality. And Long's theory is more subtle than this. But it's important to remember it's not the case that we can just assign the correct weight to each of those factors and then use it as a model to predict success or failure in language learning. So yes, aptitude, motivation, attitude do go some way to explaining success, but the way those things operate in an individual is unique to that individual, and it's unpredictable. And this is clear if you think about it from your own perspective. So maybe you have tried to learn a language before. Why did you succeed, or why did you fail? Why did you continue, or why did you stop? Maybe you signed up on a course and you were good initially, you were doing well, and then you stopped for some reason. So maybe you got another hobby, or maybe there was disruption in your routine. Maybe you just lost interest in the language. Your curiosity was satisfied. You said, okay, that's enough Italian. There is actually an infinity of possible reasons why you might have stopped. And ultimately, this was your decision. You had free will. Human behavior is not deterministic. And so any explanation about this will necessarily not be universal, and it will not be law-like. And in that respect, SLA is not a science in the same way that physics and chemistry are sciences, because we cannot predict learning. I think that it has elements, it uses elements of the scientific method. So researchers might have a theory about some isolated event in a particular group. So suppose you notice that people who have paid more for a course also get higher grades for that course. You notice a pattern, and you hypothesize that it's because the people who paid more are doing more homework. And then this could be checked. So this is using part of the scientific method of coming up with a testable hypothesis, but it's about a specific group at a specific time. It's not a general theory of SLA. I think a more general theory will probably not be testable because it relates to aspects of the mind and social interactions which cannot be empirically tested. So just to give one example, in SLA research, one factor which is thought to be important is anxiety. So if you have lower anxiety, then you're more likely to succeed in learning a foreign language. And so the implication is that you should try and keep your students' anxiety low, because if they're more relaxed, then they will learn more. And so teachers try and create a positive atmosphere, and they praise their students and don't put them on the spot. And all of those things I do, and I did them before I even knew what SLA was. And I do not praise my students because I've heard of research saying that it will help them to learn. I praise my students when they get things right, to show them that they are on the right track, and to give them clear feedback, to express my pride in them as a genuine part of our interactions. And all of that just comes from my ideas about how to interact with people and my values as a teacher. It doesn't come from the results of an empirical study into success and failure in SLA. So yes, SLA is a field which uses the scientific method, but I don't think that there is such a thing as a scientific theory of how languages are learned, because that question is only partly amenable to scientific investigation. I think another controversial example is how negative feedback affects SLA. So just going down to page 36, Long writes, provision of negative feedback, for example, might eventually turn out not to be a relevant factor in the theory of SLA, as argued persuasively by Schwartz 1993, but its empirical track record to date as a facilitator of rate and arguably level of ultimate attainment makes it a legitimate component of a theory of SLA. Just to define negative feedback, I think that he means correction. So a student is talking and you just repeat what they've said, but you correct their grammar. That would be an example of negative feedback. So he's saying that maybe negative feedback is not relevant, but from all of the empirical data we have, it seems to be relevant. And I just want to say, yeah, there are lots of studies trying to look for correlations between different types of negative feedback and different types of success measured in every different way that you could imagine. And most of them do say that negative feedback is helpful. And that obviously makes sense, because I'm only making an error because I don't know that it's an error. And so if you tell me it's an error, then I'll have learned something. But the important thing is how people interpret the negative feedback. Because if you give me feedback and I'm not listening, then I won't learn from it. And so that's why there is even any controversy about it, because different studies will tell you different things. And I think it just depends on context and on what learners are doing with the information and on their relationship with the teacher. And none of that can really be accounted for in an experiment. You could interview people and find out their views on correction, so more of a qualitative study. But at best, you can only test that very indirectly. And I've been assuming throughout this discussion that there is a difference between science and non-science. In the philosophy of science, this is called the criterion of demarcation. And a criterion of demarcation is just what tells you the difference between science and non-science. And I think Long may have different assumptions about this from me, because he draws heavily on the work of someone called Larry Loudon, who is a philosopher of science who criticized demarcation criteria. So he wrote a paper called The Demise of the Demarcation Problem, where he made a series of arguments against demarcation, which I think are not correct. Okay, so here he says, A demarcation will typically assert the epistemic superiority of science over non-science. This could be true in some cases, but this doesn't need to be what a demarcation criterion is doing. The point is not to devalue everything that's not science. It's just to say what is characteristic of the scientific method, what makes it different from other disciplines. And he thinks that historically, demarcation criteria were formulated by people with an axe to grind. He gives examples of this this is page 119. So Aristotle was wanted to embarrass practitioners of Hippocratic medicine, and logical positivists wanted to repudiate metaphysics, and Popper was out to get Marx and Freud. So he's saying that people were just coming up with demarcation criteria to discredit some ideas that they didn't like. And he's just mixed up completely different things here. And so the logical positivists had this thing called the verification principle, and it was a criterion of meaning. So they really did think that everything that was not verifiable was meaningless. Popper did not think that at all. So he was just trying to describe the scientific method, not to say that science is superior to non-science. Popper's view of demarcation was highly influential. And so his idea was that for a theory to be scientific, it needs to be falsifiable. So you need to be able to say what would refute this theory, what observation could you make that would prove this theory wrong. And that's important because it would tell you something about how the theory fares compared to its rivals. And Loudon also has something to say about Popper's criterion. So this is from page 121. He thinks that Popper's criterion of demarcation would admit some clearly unscientific ideas. So we've got flat earthers, biblical creationists, Uri Geller devotees, etc., and claims that these people make are provably false. And so he thinks that makes them scientific because they will make testable predictions. But this is totally wrong because, so for example, take flat earthers. You're talking to a flat earther and you are pointing out all of the discrepancies between their claims and reality. So, but like, look at the movements of the planets, and look, you can see the curvature of the Earth from space, and so on. And so, how do they respond to you? They must have some rationalization of all of the counter evidence, and so they might say, well, that footage is fake, or that's a conspiracy. And that is exactly the opposite of the scientific method, because the whole point of falsifiability is that you are prepared to drop a theory if it doesn't pass stringent tests. And so if you're just making ridiculous claims about reality, which are clearly contradicted by all of the information that we have, and then you're rationalizing it, then like that's exactly the thing that Popper's demarcation criterion was supposed to disqualify. And I think part of the problem is that Loudon is thinking about this whole topic in terms of statements. So he also mentions the fact that the criterion leaves ambiguous the scientific status of virtually every singular existential statement, however well supported. But the thing is, science is not a set of isolated statements. So in science, there are theories or explanations, and then there are related testable predictions or testable hypotheses, and then there's the background knowledge, so like knowledge about how your apparatus works, and then related theories, and then just assumptions that you need to make for your theory to work. And so it doesn't really make sense to apply it to isolated statements. So something like the claim that there are atoms, this is just ambiguous. I don't think it makes sense to discuss whether that is scientific or non-scientific. It's too ambiguous for me to say anything about it. Long doesn't talk about any of this, but I've just mentioned it because it really does matter how researchers are using data and what is the scientific status of the field. But so what Long uses Loudon for is his theory of scientific progress as problem solving. The idea is that we come up with scientific theories in order to solve problems. Yeah, so there are three types of empirical problem that a theory could solve. So a potential problem, that's phenomena for which there is no explanation. A solved problem, that's phenomena which are explained by your preferred theory. And then there is an anomalous problem, phenomena which are accounted for by a rival theory, but not by your theory. And it could be either contradicting your theory or not, but the point is that there is a rival theory which does explain it and yours doesn't. So applied to an example from SLA about the critical period hypothesis, there is an idea that SLA is slower in older starters just because of circumstance as opposed to biological changes in the brain. So things like differences in motivation, different length of exposure, different opportunities to learn. And this is not the term for it, but I'll just call it the non-biological view. So an anomalous problem for the non-biological view is that it doesn't explain the fact that there is still a pattern of poor achievement in late starters compared to younger starters, which occurs regardless of motivation. So it doesn't matter how motivated you are or how much exposure you get, you are still less successful. People are still less successful as they get older. So whereas theories of biologically scheduled constraints, so critical or sensitive periods for SLA, do explain key phenomena, namely the inverse relationship between age and language learning success, and also just the separation of language learning and intelligence. So it doesn't matter how dumb you are, and it doesn't matter like what teaching methods your teachers used or where you grew up or who you were hanging around with, you will emerge from childhood as a native speaker of your language, regardless of all of that. All you need is exposure. All you need is just not to be locked in a room and totally isolated from all language. And so, yes, so that would be an example of an anomalous problem for the non-biological view. And so a key point that comes from Loudon is that good theories solve problems, i.e. they, and I'm just going to read from page 35, they account for widely accepted phenomena in the field in need of explanation. When two theories are on offer in the same domain, the better theory is the one that solves more problems. So good theories account for widely accepted phenomena in the field in need of explanation. I think that this oversimplifies the debate in two ways. In the natural sciences, the challenge is normally just to come up with one good explanation of the phenomena. So they are not in a position of having five really good theories of gravity and then just being able to pick the theory which best conforms with observation. And in social science, on the other hand, I think people are often in a position of having to criticize the data itself. So I'll leave an example in the references in the description. So just one example, Van Hove 2013 criticizes previous attempts to collect data related to the critical period hypothesis. And so I'm just saying it's not as simple as just coming up with a theory that matches widely accepted phenomena. Okay, moving on to section 2 of this podcast. Starting with the third section of chapter 3, Long begins to outline a series of problems in Loudon's sense and explanations about SLA. So problem 1 is purely incidental and implicit child first language acquisition is overwhelmingly successful, like we said before. And then problem 2, purely incidental and implicit adult second language acquisition is highly variable and largely unsuccessful. So yeah, this is the idea that, as I said before, children just learn their first language almost inevitably. Whereas if you take any set of adults trying to learn a second language later in life, some of them will be successful, some of them will be maybe mildly successful, and then some will just never crack it. And I want to comment on some of the remarks that Long makes in this section and respond to them. He refers to a lot of very interesting research into adult learners reaching native-like ability, if that's in inverted commas, native-like ability in a second language. So just reading from page 38. With adults, lengthy periods of optimal exposure can result in near native, not native-like communicative abilities, and then in only a tiny minority of cases. And as documented in the extensive literature on maturational constraints, never, as far as we know, in native-like abilities, the few apparent counterexamples being methodological artifacts. Okay, so just to rephrase that, so he's saying that if you look at adults who have tried to learn a second language, they never become exactly like a native speaker. Some get close, and he's saying that's only a tiny minority of cases. And there are some supposed counterexamples, and he's saying that they are methodological artifacts. So that would be an artificial finding that's just caused by the data collection method. He cites quite a famous study, Ioup et al. 1994, and then he also mentions it below. So the best results for adults are poorer than the routine achievements of young children with early sustained exposure, even when conditions are seemingly optimal. This is shown, for example, by a study of two exceptional American women's highly successful but still non-native-like command of Arabic after 20 years in Egypt. So just a side point about this. He's making it sound like the results in Ioup et al. 1994 were methodological artifacts. And then he cites three sources, and none of these sources made a claim to this effect about Ioup et al. So I'm going to give some background on this study just to clarify what it was actually about. So Julie was a British woman who moved to Egypt at the age of 21 when she married an Egyptian man. And she was then living with, I think, with his in-laws or with some other Egyptian family. They didn't speak English, and so she had constant, intensive exposure to the language. And after 2.5 years, she was able to pass as a native speaker. So just to read a quote from this paper. So this is Ioup et al. 1991. To summarize the extent of Julie's achievement in Egyptian Arabic, she has no noticeable foreign accent, makes few mistakes in morphology and syntax, has good control of the lexicon, including conventionalized forms, and appears to have sophisticated discourse competence. And in a footnote, it also mentions that Egyptian colleagues of the authors who interacted with Julie in these early years recollect her native-like ability at that point. So this is a person who has not only passed a battery of tests given by researchers, but she also appears to be a native speaker to everyone around her. And it could be easy to fool someone into thinking that you're a native speaker if you just have a good accent, or if your interactions are sufficiently limited. You could fool someone. So I'm not saying that that's enough to prove that someone has native proficiency. I think this should all be taken with a pinch of salt. But it's not the case that she seems to be a counterexample, but then really she isn't. So that's not what this research is saying. So I'm going to just go more into detail about this article. So another thing Long implies is that Julie merely had a lengthy period of exposure with no formal instruction, or sorry, with no explicit instruction. But that's not true. And you can see it from the learning strategies that Julie employed when she was learning Egyptian Arabic. So she had a copybook, and she would take notes in this notebook to help her remember and make sense of the language. So just to read a passage from here, at first her notation were unanalyzed wholes with attempts at guessing meanings. Soon she began to keep separate pages for nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Lexical meaning was the main priority, but some elements of inflectional morphology were noted, especially changes involving gender, number, and person. The copybook was kept for 3 to 4 months. She remembers that fixed expressions and idioms were the most salient items in that early stage of acquisition and were used frequently to enhance communication. Oh, and then key part here, explicit feedback was received when her errors hampered communication. Feedback usually took the form of corrected or expanded repetitions. Julie recalls that she would make mental or written note of the point of the correction. So Julie's learning experience was naturalistic in the sense that she wasn't going to school. She didn't study Egyptian Arabic at university. She was just teaching herself. But clearly there is explicit instruction going on here. Julie herself was a language teacher, and so she probably knew a lot about just learning strategies for learning a foreign language. So she's writing verbs, nouns, and adjectives in a notebook and writing down corrections. So this is not just exposure. And incidentally, I think Julie's learning reflects the very theory of second language acquisition that Long advocates, because he thinks that learning is mostly implicit, but then you also need what he calls a focus on form. So a focus on language, analyzing language. And that's exactly what Julie was doing. Going back to Long, so in the part of chapter 3 where he gives his first explanation, which is adult SLA is maturationally constrained. So in other words, he supports the critical period hypothesis. He thinks there are biological constraints on the ability to learn language. And he refers again to potential counterexamples. So examples of late starters who achieve, quote, across the board native-like attainment by a late starter. And he says there are no such examples that would stand up in court. Apparent counterexamples are just that, apparent. And again, he cites several people, none of whom do anything to refute the results of Ioup et al. So if we have a look at DeKeyser and Larson-Hall 2005, I've got that here. This is the only substantial comment they make about Ioup et al. In terms of morphosyntax, Ioup et al. 1994 merely documented that 2 adult learners of Arabic as a second language and language teachers themselves did very well. Not that they were completely indistinguishable from natives. The study did not show that they were completely indistinguishable from natives. I didn't have access to all of these sources he cites, but looking now at Long 2005, so this is another source he cites to show that the counterexamples are not legitimate. So when he's talking about different studies trying to find exceptions to the critical period hypothesis, and he mentions Ioup et al. At the end of this paragraph, when batteries of tasks are employed, as in, I won't read all the names, but as in Ioup et al., we see adult starters able to pass as native-like on some tests, but not others. So, and this is acknowledged by the authors. So he's just saying exactly what the authors themselves say in the paper, which is that the 2 people in the study, Julie and Laura, do make mistakes, but so do the native speakers in the study. People in the literature tend to dismiss this study as not really an example of someone who is truly native-like. And I'm just going to focus, there are 2 people in the study, but I'll focus more on Julie, so the one who taught herself. So she failed part of the grammar section of the tests that the researchers did. And the reason why they judged that she failed is not the number of mistakes that she made, because the native speakers made just as many mistakes as she did. The problem was that there seemed to be a pattern to the mistakes that she was making. So she particularly made mistakes with optional word order in questions. And it was the same with Laura. Laura had some other pattern of mistakes, while the native speakers seemed to just have a more random pattern of mistakes. So the question, does this really matter for assigning native-like status? So you've got 2 speakers of a language, and one of them is a native speaker, makes lots of mistakes, but they're just random mistakes. And then the other one is non-native speaker and similar number of mistakes, but they are all in a particular area. So I suppose the idea is that if your mistakes follow a pattern, then it's more likely to be because of either first language interference or just because of gap in your knowledge that's a result of just the difficulty of learning as an adult. So Julie was not aware of all of the options for word order in questions because being an English speaker, so she thinks that questions need to have a very specific word order. So that could be first language interference. But the thing is, so, okay, they're comparing Julie and Laura to 11 native speakers of Egyptian Arabic, and they're saying that the native speakers just made random mistakes. But were they looking for a pattern in the native speakers' mistakes? And they only asked 11 people. What if they asked 100 people and then they found a pattern in the native speakers' mistakes? I know native speakers who don't know any irregular past participles, so there is a pattern to their mistakes. Does that mean that they should be demoted from native speaker status? I don't think so. And just to read the author's conclusion about the grammar section, additional testing is needed to provide a better comparison of the internal organization of the learner's grammars with the structural organization of native grammars. So the authors are not saying she was just an apparent counterexample. They're not saying that she failed the tests. They're actually just saying it's inconclusive, and there seems to be a pattern to her errors, which makes them doubt whether she is whether her proficiency is fully native-like in a very specific area. Just when it came to knowing all of the options for word order in questions. And then the one other place where Julie was different from the native speaker norm was in this section called Interpretation of Anaphora. Interpretation of anaphora. Anaphora, it's when you use a word and it refers back to something that you've mentioned before. So we have an example here. I'll just read the English translation. Nadia saw Mona when she entered the room. And so anaphora is using she to refer back to either Nadia or Mona. This is a deliberately ambiguous sentence. And so they gave Julie a load of sentences like this. So Julie's answers differed from most native speakers when identifying reference of an embedded clause. And so we've got this sentence. I'll just read the English translation. Ahmed bought the dress for the girl that you went to the lady that she angered. So Julie would see a sentence and then she would have to answer a question. So the question, who angered whom? And most native speakers thought it was the girl who angered the lady, whereas Julie answered that the lady angered the girl. And I think it's something to do with the use of this pronoun. And I think the authors had a theory about what this conveys about your knowledge of how to use this word. But so this is the type of question that Julie failed. And they also say this is the only task that consistently distinguishes Julie from native speakers. I think just in this section, because she does also have difficulty with optional word ordering questions. Yeah, just a few things to say about this. So for one thing, what does it mean to say that she got this question wrong? It means that she was not in the majority of native speakers' answers. So this table shows the items. So we just looked at item 13. It shows the rate of native speaker agreement. So the 11 native speakers, how many of them agreed about the answer to the question? And so with item 13, there was 91% agreement, which means that 10 of them agreed that it was the girl angered the lady, and then there was one native speaker who agreed with Julie. And then the cross here just shows where Julie's interpretation was different from the majority of native speakers. So notice every case where Julie disagrees, there is at least one native speaker who agrees with Julie and disagrees with the other native speakers. So what are we saying about the people who are not in this majority? Are we saying their command of the language is somehow defective? Another point is notice that the other participant, Laura, so she was the other person, I think she's American and she learned Egyptian Arabic at university. Notice that she did not deviate at all. So she got all of these questions, quote, right. And so this could just be a test of how well educated you are. So Laura went to university and maybe she was used to reading very long and convoluted sentences. And so she was just more proficient in processing them. And that would suggest that it's just a gap in Julie's knowledge. And so if Julie went and did a course at a university in Egypt, then she would catch up and she wouldn't make these mistakes. And then maybe the same with the native speakers. Maybe they also need to improve their Arabic. But then, I mean, the main thing is just notice how long and convoluted this sentence is. Ahmed bought the dress for the girl that you went to the lady that she angered. It's actually nonsensical. This shift in subject makes no sense in English. And I did ask two Arabic speakers what they thought about this sentence. And one of them, who was actually from Libya, but familiar with Egyptian Arabic, said it's a very awkward sentence. It sounds like it's deliberately trying to be ambiguous about who angered whom. And then I asked a native speaker of Egyptian Arabic, and he gave the same answer. And he thought that the that in the middle didn't need to be there. And he acknowledged that the language is always changing. And maybe it would have sounded more correct 30 years ago when this was published. So who knows? But I mean, it's interesting that neither of them said, oh, yeah, it's correct. They both said it's really weird and ambiguous. And a more general point about all of the sentences in this study is that they are decontextualized, they're inauthentic, so they were just, I think that they were just made up by the authors. They're designed to be confusing. And so, of course, there is not going to be agreement about the sentences, even among native speakers. And despite this, Julie is right just as often as the native speakers. So I think it's unnecessarily harsh. I think people dismissing this research are unnecessarily harsh because all they've done is show that of a whole battery of language tests, the two test subjects, just in two cases, were not in agreement with a majority of the 11 native speakers in the study. That's all it showed. And this gets into the whole issue of the very terms native speaker and native-like, which are problematic. It's hard to define what a native speaker actually is. It doesn't reflect many real people's situations. So maybe a child who was born abroad or raised bilingual, or a child of immigrants, someone who spoke English at home but then not English outside. And then also, what about people who didn't have exposure to English until they were older, but then learned it extremely successfully and speak perfectly and write perfectly, but they've got an accent? How many people do you know who are like that? I can think of many. So are we really saying that these people have a worse command of the language, or that they are less successful than someone who passes a battery of tests and who fully conforms with all of the intuitions of a native speaker? And this is Long's criterion of scrutinized native likeness, which has been criticized elsewhere, not in the chapter. And this is a tangent from the chapter, but it's very interesting. So there's a great paper by Singleton and Leshniewska, 2021. I'll put it in the description. And they argue against this idea of scrutinized native likeness. So one thing is that native speakers all differ in their intuitions, as we just saw in that study. Native speakers routinely fall short of the idealized norm because everyone speaks differently, everyone has different intuitions about the language. So I'm just going to share one example of this.
The coach made sure to blank the strengths of each player. She wanted to build their confidence before the next game. So the options are extol, forestall, eschew, and abhor. I've never heard any of these words in my life. The new theme park has been a real blank to the area, bringing in millions of tourists every year. It's either boon, prose, tremor, or dent. Am I stupid? But let me know if you knew any of these answers, because apparently I don't know English.
He does know English, but not all native speakers know all the same words. So yeah, that's a big problem with this idea of scrutinized native likeness. And another problem is the idea that if you are bilingual, then that could change the way that you process both your first language and the additional language. And they could affect each other in such a way that you simply don't talk the same as someone who is monolingual, someone who has only learned one language. And so I think it's unfair for you to be compared with monolinguals. That doesn't mean that there is something defective about your command of the language. It just means that you have different intuitions about the language. And this idea that you have to be indistinguishable from a native speaker actually makes the critical period hypothesis unfalsifiable in the sense of defined by Popper that I mentioned earlier. It's unfalsifiable because if your background is different from mine, then by definition you will have different intuitions from me. And so he's saying that like anything which is different about a non-native speaker shows that they are not native-like. And by definition, you are going to find something that is different. And just because you have some different intuitions, it may have no bearing whatsoever on your command of the language for any practical purpose. So, in other words, for example, Julie appeared. So everyone around Julie thought that she is a native speaker of Egyptian Arabic, and the researchers noticed a pattern of errors in her intuitions in two areas, and they were saying, because they've noticed a pattern, that is not native like. But the thing is, you could find that in any you could find some area of difference in any non-native speaker, however good their level was. Is that a sign of failure to attain a second language? I don't think so. And I think it's the same for people who learn the language extremely well and they can do everything that I can do, but they have an accent. So for me, those people are fully successful in acquiring a second language. And so you might say, well, okay, but yes, you can learn the language extremely well, but then you'll always have an accent. Yeah, there are studies, and Julie is an example of someone who has adopted the accent of a second language. So whichever area you take, whether you're talking about phonology or grammatical competence, or any other area, and you say, well, adult learners can't succeed. Actually, there are always exceptions. So, yeah, I mean, just because there are exceptions, the overwhelming trend is for first language acquisition to be successful and second language acquisition to be relatively unsuccessful, despite those exceptions. And so this is really a tangent from, I think, from Long's main message. Clearly, it's much harder to learn a language as you get older. It takes more effort. You need to pay more attention. Yeah, it's not going to happen by osmosis, although that's not how it works with children either. But the point is, it's harder. Yes, it's clearly harder to learn a language when you're older. Is it because of biological changes, or is it because of circumstantial changes, or is it cultural? I don't know. But I don't think that Long has successfully argued in this section that it is a biological constraint. But I don't think it matters for the arguments that he goes on to make, because the fact of the matter is, yes, by and large, adults are, he calls them partly disabled language learners. And yes, by and large, that is true. And so none of this affects any of the arguments that he makes later. I'm going to end this part and then pick up again with the third section of this podcast, which is about implicit and explicit learning. I will see you there.